The title of the panel is Russia's Propaganda War, Old Playbook, New Methods, Weaponization of Information. Propaganda war, Russian disinformation has become more persistent, more sophisticated, and more insidious since the invasion of Ukraine, and arguably as compared to the Soviet period. And this is something I've seen not only in the propaganda world, but in the diplomatic world, where I used to go to international conferences of the OSCE in the mid-'80s, and the Soviets were pretty bad with their propaganda and with their lies. When I've seen the Russians in action at OSCE meetings in recent years, they've been even worse than the Soviets were in the early to mid-'80s. And if you remember, that was the Brezhnev and Andropov period. So that to me is very telling. Now, the Russian aim isn't to necessarily get people to believe everything they say, but to muddy the waters, raising doubt in people's minds. Sort of this moral equivalence, including my pet peeve of false equivalence, of blaming both Russia and Ukraine equally for Minsk violations. This is, of course, and David, I think Kramer touched upon this or mentioned this earlier today. It's not only inaccurate because the preponderance of violations occurs on the Russian side, but also it forgets who the aggressor is and who the victim is. So I look forward to hearing from our panelists discuss how best to counter this particular form of aggression. Karen DeWeesha, I think because everybody was here, and just to speed it up, I will not introduce you yet again. Her biography is in the packets you received, but I'll quickly introduce the others. Alina Polakova is the Deputy Director of Dino Patrica Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and a Senior Fellow in the Council's Future Europe Initiative. And by the way, the Atlantic Council has really become the lead think tank on Ukraine. It's been incredibly active in the last 2 or 3 years. Alina has previously served as an advisor to NGOs throughout Europe and the US, working to promote democracy and government reform in Eastern Europe. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Christopher Walker is the Vice President for Studies and Analysis at NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. His previous positions include Vice President for Strategy and Analysis in Freedom House, Senior Associate at the East-West Institute, and Program Manager at the European Journalism Network. Our moderator, I think, is well known to everybody here, is Miroslava Gongadze. She's been chief of the Ukrainian service at the Voice of America for about a year now, since October 2016, a memorable year. She joined VOA in 2004. Prior to that, she worked at RFE-RL. She's an award-winning journalist and a longtime advocate of independent media and human and various political rights in Ukraine. In 2014, she was awarded the Order of Princess Olga by the President of Ukraine. And in 2016, Ukraine's Focus magazine ranked her 61st in their list of the 100 most influential women in Ukraine, which is kind of neat, as she doesn't live in Ukraine. So that says something. In any case, Miroslava, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Orest. Thank you, Orest, and thank you all for being interested in this very crucial and important topic, specifically in this time of war and Russian aggression. And thank you, U.S. Ukraine Foundation, for organizing this thought-provoking conference. I know you're all a little bit tired, but hopefully this panel will bring you up to life, back to life. So what is Russian propaganda? How Putin's Russia developed its capacity, and how are we doing battling this problem? Today we have an excellent group of experts on this issue. And I will start with a little remarks on Russian propaganda. The more you doubt, as Orest already said, the less you trust. This is the premise of Russian broadcast to the world. Information warfare is not just about getting your own message across. It's also and mainly involves confusing, distracting, dividing, and demoralizing the adversary. That is what Russia is doing to the West, starting with Russia Today, RT, that reports foreign news all over the world. Russian media outlets are acting as a corrosive, anti-systemic force. Their motto, question more. It's not a call to independent critical thinking, but it's an attack on the whole idea of truth and certainty. Many commentators view Kremlin's propaganda today as a rival of Soviet propaganda of several decades ago, as Orest again mentioned. While there are a lot of similarities, I think Russian propaganda is much more dangerous and disturbing in its consequences than Soviet propaganda. So my question is to Karen. How do we recognize propaganda and how dangerous it is for the world?
Well, I don't want to be misunderstood in terms of saying that I'm defending RT. But I do think that we underestimate it to our disadvantage. And the people who are in charge of RT, who are effectively in charge of, or at the forefront of Russian propaganda, of course they're not in charge of it, are not the least capable amongst the Russian information sector. Margaret Simonyan had a rather good career and was and is regarded by people whom I value as a rather good professional. Kiselyov, in another life, was a liberal who was very much in favor of privatization and reform of the economy and so forth. So these are people who are not by nature Goebbels, although given Goebbels' interest in art, I would say probably Goebbels wasn't even Goebbels. So the thing that I wanted to mention about Simonyan was my congratulations to her, if she's listening, that when National Westminster in the UK announced it was going to freeze the RT accounts, which are, by the way, that decision is under review and has not yet been taken, she came out with a statement, so much for freedom of the press. You know, that's good for her. And it got reported in all the Western newspapers because that's what we try to do. We always like to have both points of view. So let's just talk about that freedom of the press. Well, Kremlin is using the openness of our institutions to promote its goals. Its kleptocracy wouldn't work without our banks. It's the legal position of its oligarchs and their ability to protect their interests in Europe and the United States wouldn't work without our lobbying firms and our law firms. And in fact, their message would not get across without RT, which is properly licensed in our countries. And their presence, RT's presence, does pose a rather significant challenge to our embrace of core Western principles of openness, transparency, and so forth. My own view about England is the situation in England is somewhat muddied by my own experience in England, where Cambridge University Press refused to publish my book because they felt, quote, there was nothing that I could do to edit it to give them the necessary comfort that they would not be subject to action by Russian interests. And at the same time, they are licensing RT. So we are, in fact, fighting a rather unequal fight because we don't have the political support that we would sometimes like against Russian involvement in our societies. However, we should remember that the famous case in our Supreme Court where Hustler was allowed to stay open and publish pornography because of our commitment to First Amendment. So if not Hustler, then why would we move against RT? It's a real problem. There's no doubt that the Kremlin is using the openness of our system to promote its objectives, to weaken the West, to divide the West, to promote conspiracy theories that build up Trump supporters, right-wing and left-wing supporters in other countries, and as you said very correctly, to destroy the very idea that there is something that's true, that there are facts that are not capable of being contested. Everything is capable of being contested, and if you think about RT's motto, ask more questions, my view is RT's actual motto is be more crazy. And we are facing a political revolution in all of these countries in which craziness is somehow embraced. And we're seeing it in our own politics. So what to do about that? And I'm just going to make very specific comments because I know that both of the other panelists are more than capable of talking about this, more capable than I am of talking about this. But I do think that we don't help our case about the intrinsic superiority of our institutions by attacking RT directly. What we need to do is to attack their arguments, which are patently crazy and which are very easily challenged in the public. I think that we've heard this morning the extent to which the U.S. Congress passes without debate resolutions in favor of Ukraine. That's not to say they couldn't do more in specific policy terms, but the public argument on Ukraine is lost by Russia. It is lost. So I don't even know what they could do to get it back. I don't think that Stephen Cohen is going to be able of doing what is necessary to get that argument back. And I'm not saying he's an agent of RT. But we need to promote the message on Ukraine. We need to promote the message on the Baltics, how far they've come, on what these are all countries that came out of the same space. They all came out of the Soviet Union. And when you go to Kiev or you go to the Baltic states and you see roads that don't have potholes, that's a tax imposed by corruption in Russia. There are reasons why there's nothing like this works in Russia, because there's a tax on every action, on every movement, on every road. We saw that in Sochi when Boris Nemtsov estimated that it would have been cheaper to pave the road from the airport to the Olympic Village with caviar. It cost so much. This is a cost of corruption, and exposing it, talking about it constantly, promoting good people who are doing work on it is, I think, very important. We need to fund more serious study of Russia and of Ukraine. We lost, and I say this as someone who trained undergraduates in Ohio. We have 500,000 people of Slavic heritage in Ohio. Many of them come to Miami to study Russian. They are hired by the U.S. government. After 9/11, they were all retrained in Arabic, all of them. We didn't succeed in placing one person in a Russian-speaking intel role. This is just horrible. So we need to retrain a whole new generation of people. And we need to support our own institutions to shine a light on the activities in D.C. and in London of oligarchs. And I don't put a national adjective here. And I think we know why. On the activity of oligarchs in working to close down serious research into their activities. And both of those countries are doing this in this town. And that doesn't help the fight against corruption in Ukraine, and we need to really stand firm against it.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much. I have many questions to your statement, but hopefully you will be able to stay a little longer. So, Chris, it feels like for a long time the West has been asleep on this issue. After 1991, Western countries scaled down information warfare. We were very equipped during Cold War. Then when Putin took power and seized the control over its own media, broadcast media, outsiders felt sorry for him, but refused to accept that actually information can be used as a tool in war information, and can be a threat to foreign policy. So why did it happen, and how did Russia develop its information manipulation capacity in front of Westernized?
Thank you, Miroslava. You've identified a key point in this story, which is, if we look back 25 years ago, the common assumption was that countries like Russia would, over time, liberalize. It might not be so easy, but over time, this would be the end effect. And this was also the assumption about the media, that the world was becoming more open. Certainly with the internet, the idea was that you'd have more space for discussion. This would, in turn, kind of break down the closed systems that had their grip on so many countries, not only in the former Soviet Union, but elsewhere. And if we fast forward and we look backward, we see that those assumptions weren't right. And in fact, as Russia became more authoritarian, what they gave a priority to was their media. And they modernized their media in ways that I think most people didn't count on. And so if you look at what Russia has done at the domestic level, I think it's very important to understand, as Miroslava mentioned, on the one hand, there was an effort to take control of all mass media, which was highly effective. Today, Russians, to the tune of 85 or 90%, still get their news and information from television. And national television broadcasting in Russia today is controlled by the authorities. It means that the main ways people understand the world are controlled by the authorities. At the same time, it wasn't all that long ago when people said, well, don't worry, the internet is still open in Russia. And that's changed quite dramatically as well over the last few years, where there's still space in some respects, but the degree of manipulation, the degree of regulation, intimidation, a whole set of tools that are used to suppress meaningful political speech have really taken hold. So I think it's fair to say that at the domestic level, there's been an extraordinary amount of learning, experimentation, propaganda coupled with censorship. Propaganda functions best when it uses censorship. This, of course, has grown in the Russian context. But I would really note, and it's critical to understanding what Ukraine has faced, but I think as importantly what this means for the wider world, is that so much of what the Russian authorities have developed at the domestic level has also had application beyond the country's borders. So in the same way that domestic bloggers in Russia, or political oppositionists, or media that had an independent line was targeted with hacking, trolling, other forms of obstruction, essentially denial of free speech, we now see these same techniques or adapted version of them being applied to Russia's west. Ukraine is on the front line in this battle, but now we see this in Central Europe. It's not just RT. In fact, in Central Europe, just to use this example, it's not RT all that much. It's websites that are supported by Russia or its surrogates that are in the many dozens operating in countries like Slovakia, the Czech Republic. This complements other media instruments that are transnational. It's not just television, but it's also radio, it's Sputnik on the web. And so I think there's really been an extraordinary degree of learning that's been applied. And now we see hacking, trolling, cyber attacks that are almost routine, well beyond the Russian Federation's borders. And I think it's a reminder that the domestic kind of character and profile really can inform the international preferences of these sorts of regimes, and it's impacting the discussion in so many ways that Karen alluded to. And I think so long as the media space remains fragmented and independent media remains weak, we're going to have a very serious long-term challenge to restore the integrity of the media space so that you can have meaningful, legitimate discussion online and elsewhere, because this is really the target of these efforts. It's to obstruct, deny, confuse, and otherwise prevent legitimate discussion. And I think this was sorely underappreciated. Not all that long ago, decade and a half ago, the common assumption was that in the internet age, everything would be more open, the conversations would be more vibrant. Certainly that's true to a degree, but the companion piece of this story is that it's also more polluted, it's more obstructed, and it's more problematic in many ways. So I think it requires a lot of fresh thinking about how to get at this challenge, and I'm happy to share some ideas in the Q&A.
Fantastic. Yeah, clearly Russia were much more effective in embracing internet age into their advantage. Belated counter attack has begun after Maidan and Russian aggression in Ukraine, and Ukrainians created this Stop Fake project. Small number of Western experts start speaking around the world and raising the issue and trying to bring attention to the problem. So I would like to address, Alina, how successful do you think we are in the West and in Ukraine is in battling Russian propaganda? And is it not too little, too late?
So thank you, Miroslava, and thank you to the U.S. Ukraine Foundation for hosting this event and this important discussion on this specific topic. Before I get to your question, Miroslava, I wanted to pick up on something that Karen said in her opening remarks. She talked about journalistic balance. And this is a really interesting point, I think, because journalistic balance is something that we pride in open societies as part of our freedom of speech, part of our idea of objectivity when we do news reporting specifically. Miroslava, you know this better than I do, of course. But this is also a Western virtue that Russia has been able to very effectively turn into a deep vulnerability. And so what we see now is this tendency and desire to present a balanced point of view. Many journalists and editors and newscasters end up having, on the one side, you have the Ukrainian point of view, and on the other side, you have a propagandist, right? And this is not what balance is supposed to be. Just to give you an example of what I mean here, and I have to admit this is something I am stealing from Edward Lucas, who I saw recently. For example, if you want to host a conversation on German-Israeli relations, you may invite a German expert and an Israeli expert, but you certainly wouldn't invite a Holocaust denier, right? And if you don't invite a Holocaust denier, I doubt that you would get many emails and Twitter attacks and troll attacks demanding why that was not a balanced point of view. And this is really how we have to think about what Russian propaganda is, because there are facts and then there are lies. And presenting lies is never the aim or goal of balanced reporting. And so I think we really have to look at our own values and principles and think about how we are being used and manipulated by authoritarian regimes like Russia, but also others. So that was just my quick comment on that. And to get to Ukraine very quickly, this question of whether the West is asleep. I do think when it comes to responding to Russian disinformation, it has been asleep. And I do think there's also a Ukrainian tendency, and as somebody from Ukraine, I can say this, I think, without people getting too upset, to always think that everything is bad and miserable and about to fall apart. Maybe it's more of a Slavic tendency. And I think on this particular issue, that's really not the case. I was just last week at a conference on strategic communications in the Czech Republic, which sought to bring together all of the different national governments, NATO, allied countries, and EU representatives that are working on strategic communications when it comes to finding solutions and countering disinformation. And what I learned from this conference, after hearing all these presentations from Western European countries, Central European countries, was that in fact Ukraine is quite far ahead of many countries, particularly in the West, who haven't really had to deal with this problem for very long. And just to give you a few examples of what Ukraine has done, particularly since Maidan and the new government. Now we can talk about what's been effective and what hasn't worked, but the point is that the Ukrainian government itself has taken quite a few quite radical steps to deal with the disinformation campaign. The Ukrainian government established the Ministry of Information. Again, I'm not going to talk about how effective and ineffective these things were until later. It also prohibited Russian-made films with elements of propaganda or that were produced after 2013. It's limited broadcasting of Russian TV channels that are not journalistic. I mean, I don't think we should use the term journalist for these individuals that work for the Russian government. I think, Chris, the term you sometimes use is news workers, which I also tend to like.
Soldiers of information.
Soldiers of information, I like that one too. And the government has also instituted very key media-related reforms like disclosure and transparency in media ownership, for example, and public broadcasting. These are things that are still to come. And it's also established its own arm of Ukrainian foreign broadcasting, Ukraine Today, which was supposed to be an answer to Russia Today in some ways. And the government has also tried to have its own, you could say, information campaigns. Now, some of these have not been effective. I do think blocking Russian channels, propaganda channels, has been effective. And I think that's one reason why we see Ukrainians really united around the idea of Ukraine Today. Because if everybody was still watching, Россия сегодня or NTV, and they still thought that the government in Kiev was a bunch of fascists who are about to attack Russian speakers, which is exactly what this media continues to report, I'm not sure you would have as much of a cohesion, as much union around Ukrainian identity today. So on the other hand, these top-down approaches don't tend to be effective. What some Central European countries are doing now is establishing strategic communications task forces within a particular government ministry. And this is something that I think the U.S. government needs to consider doing as well. There have been some efforts to do so. I don't think they've gone over that well yet. But the idea of having a strategic communications team, either within the State Department or maybe within DOD, Department of Defense, would be a good idea. Because right now our efforts on this aren't coordinated. Of course, we have VOA, we have RFERL, but these top-down efforts are just simply not enough. In Ukraine, we've seen this emergence of really vibrant civil society, like StopFake and others, who are doing this kind of investigative work. And again, Ukraine is really far ahead of other countries. StopFake, for example, is about to expand into Germany, doing the same service in Germany, and they've already expanded to the Czech Republic, so doing this kind of work in the Czech language and also in the German language. And to me, it's like, why aren't the German investigative groups doing this themselves? Why is it StopFake expanding into this? What they do is not that difficult, to be honest with you, for a few tech-savvy young people to do. So that's just my takeaway, is I think the West is waking up. I don't think it's too late. And I think we could learn some things from what Ukraine has done.
Thank you, Alina. Since we are actually going, don't have too much time, so I probably would open it to discussion because I'm pretty sure you have a lot of questions. And if you, so come up with the question and I can ask if you don't have right now. Okay, please.
Thank you for presenting the situation as it is right now in terms of media and communications. The U.S., up until 2000, had an agency called the U.S. Information Agency. It was very successful for many, many years, operating abroad, of which Voice of America was a strong part of. The U.S. Information Agency closed and became part of the Department of State, Bureau of Education, Cultural Affairs, and then Voice of America spun off on its own, essentially. With that, the U.S. has had no outreach, coordinated outreach media approach globally, or any strategy to be able to target any kind of media structures. And what would you suggest as maybe a reconstitute? How could we possibly reconstitute something like the U.S. Information Agency that could then be able to handle global information in a clear and unbiased format?
Chris, probably Alina a little bit touched on the topic. I would like to hear from Chris.
So I think the way I would respond is that the challenge is so complex right now. I'm not convinced that, and I think Alina suggested this, that kind of government top-down approaches can get at the enormity of the challenge. I think it has to be a part of it. But the way I would put it is, I'm also reluctant simply to use the idea of counter-propaganda in describing this challenge, because this is a piece of it. And in essence, what well-resourced illiberal countries have discovered is they can generate mountains and mountains and mountains of propaganda and disinformation. And if we spend all of our time just responding to this, reacting, we never take the initiative or get ahead of the curve. And I think part of the challenge now is to have the kind of education and analysis that's needed. So there's some very good efforts that are underway in Ukraine and the Baltic states and some of the Central European states to help a variety of audiences understand and critically think about the information they're getting. It's terribly important. This really needs to be systematized in schools now, because it's not like the old days. You know, if anyone has young kids who are just starting to use digital technology, you realize how frighteningly accessible the world is today. And it really requires something in the school setting at a very early age to teach thoughtful and critically minded ways of thinking about media. This isn't just in the context of Russia or China or Iran or these countries. It's everywhere. But it's particularly so when you have state-backed actors that are purposefully pumping lots of bad information into the information space. So that's part of it. The other big part of it, and we didn't emphasize it during the presentations, but it's really crucial, is how to help independent media. Independent media, newspapers have been in a state of duress even before the financial crisis. Since the financial crisis, it's been far worse. This means that the space where you have professional journalists helping ordinary consumers of the news understand the world is kind of wide open and crazy in the way it is now, in so many ways. It's so fragmented, it's so saturated with information, it's very fertile terrain for bad actors to put information into the space. And this is exactly what's happening. And then the third piece of this, which I think is related but distinct from the kind of education and analysis and the independent media parts, is the things that some of the Stratcom initiatives that Alina alluded to are probably better positioned to deal with, which is coming up with, I think, government-based responses to disinformation, kind of Soviet-style manipulation of the information space. I'm not sure we can make the sort of systematic headway we need to make in the absence of any of those three pieces. I think we need to have all of those in some fashion to really get at this challenge over time.
Alina, would like to comment on more?
I mean, I really agree with Chris about support for independent media, particularly in the more vulnerable states of Central Eastern Europe, including Ukraine and others, and also the Balkan states. Because the way that propaganda works, it's not about influencing public opinion per se, as I think you were saying, Miroslava. And it doesn't actually matter if you have very low viewership either. That's the other part that often we end up talking about. Well, who cares about RT or Sputnik when nobody really watches it? And we know this because they're inflating their numbers. But that's not how this works. I'll give you one example from Serbia. What happens in Serbia, because you have such an underfunded media, lack of support for journalists and editors who may not have the time or who may just be lazy, to be honest with you, when they're looking for a story and looking for analysis. And here's Sputnik, they're just providing it all for free. So you don't have to pick up the phone, you have to search for an expert, there it is. And you see this happen all the time. The stories that are put out there by the local Serbian language, Russian-sponsored propaganda news sites are just copied and pasted directly into Serbian mainstream media. Then they're reported on Serbian mainstream radio or television, often without any sort of attribution. And this is how you change the narrative. You fill a vacuum of where there are no resources to make things, quote unquote, easier for people who don't have much time or don't want to invest the time in finding out the real story.
Unfortunately, it's happening not only in Serbia, it's happening in U.S. and it's happening in Ukraine. Unfortunately, Ukrainian media, instead of learning English and going and digging for the sources, they just pick up Russian language news outlets and rewriting it. It's really, really dangerous situation. Similar happening in United States. I noticed a couple of times when Politico, let's say, or other newspapers just pick up Russian leads to the stories that are not correct. They're just lazy or don't have enough time or, again, don't have enough resources to really do their own investigation or good writing. So who else? Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Marina Rudenko, Ukraine. My question is, do you think it's important for US or European mass media to recognize that Russia used propaganda as weapon at war against Ukraine? And article, last week article from the Washington Post title, Pro-Russia media star Motorola killed by Ukrainian Nazis. And I'm sorry, who is the media star? A person who was a terrorist, who confessed in Ukrainian English newspaper Kyiv Post commentary that he killed 15 prisoners of illegal detention. It was a crime against humanity.
Yes.
So what we can do with such examples of US media which are a tool of Russian propaganda? Thank you.
That's what we just talked about. So, should we recognize RT and other Russian news outlets as a weapon or as a security threats or any other way?
I think there are two dimensions to this. One is how pressed for time and resources established news organizations are in the United States and elsewhere, with the rarest of exceptions today. Only the best financed that have kind of the sort of resource base that can allow you to do the sort of thorough journalism that's there.
But you would think that Washington Post have resources for this.
And so the second part of it is, I think, and this relates to one of the recommendations I made, I think it's not only ordinary consumers of news, but as importantly, it's editors and journalists who are working on these things to make sure that there are meaningful ways for them to understand, I think as Alina described, that news coming from state-backed sources can't be taken at face value. Let me put it this way. The Lithuanian foreign minister said it best. This is Minister Linkevičius said, a lie is not an alternative point of view. And I think you have to kind of dig down and have more critical analysis in order to make sure that you're reporting. I mean, any good journalist shouldn't be taking half-baked sources or sources that are intentionally manipulating or sidestepping the truth. I think this is a question of education and helping journalists do their jobs.
But should RT would be allowed to broadcast in the United States and in Europe?
I actually don't agree with what Karen said at the beginning. RT is not part of the free press. It is a state-sponsored foreign agent that is operating on our soils in the West with the sole purpose of manipulating our public opinion, our society, and our policymakers. They should be required to register as a foreign agent in the U.S., just as Russia has forced independent organizations to register as quote-unquote foreign agents in Russia. And I don't think this is, a double standard. Look at Russia as it is. How can we talk about RT being part of the free press when the government that funds it kills journalists? When the government that funds it closes off free expression in news media and now on the internet? How can we really talk about this as an independent media organization that should be protected under our principal idea of the First Amendment? And what Karen was saying about them using our financial institutions is another element of this as well. And I actually hope that the Brits do the right thing and close this thing down.
I think it's a fantastic note to close this session. I was told that we don't have time anymore, so thank you so much, and thank you for your attention.